Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for being here today and rolling with this little experiment that we're going to have. The idea of this session is to be as interactive as possible. So in a minute we'll be bringing up our first topic, and Becky and I will be doing a little interaction. But our real job is to get you involved in the discussion as we talk about our communications. So the way we're set up is 2 years ago, we did a survey of our members in 2015 to ask them what are the things that they could do, that we could do to help increase member satisfaction. And the two things were feeling like I'm part of Colorado Water Congress, and tell me how you're working to advance the interests of my organization. So, in short, what they wanted to do was these were the things of how can members become more connected, more involved with the organization. As I mentioned earlier at lunch, a little more than half of our members were saying that they're more moderately or actively involved in the organization, which means that it's a glass half full or empty kind of thing. We're looking at trying what we can do to try to get our members more engaged with the organization. So after we did the 2015 survey, what we did was we used that as the foundation for developing our strategic plan, which we rolled out in January. We spent about a year working on that. So we divided the whole board into 5 strategic goal areas to kind of take a look at these goal areas, but most everything we do is going to fit into one of these 5 boxes. So policy and development of advocacy, you're all familiar with most of you, I think, with our work on State Affairs Committee and the work that we do in that area. The other is education and networking, where you're at right now. Financial management, making sure that the organization is being run soundly. And then governance, which has to do with more on how we're managing the organization, especially the board. And then our most important top priority was our communications and partnerships. So from that, we said, okay, we're going to focus on communications, and the survey we just did back in July had to do with member communications. We wanted to know, are we communicating with you frequently enough? And with the answer we got, I think it was like 94% of the respondents we are communicating frequently. The results of this survey, I need to mention, are on our website. If you go into our membership tab, this survey report is on our website. We also asked, are we providing the right amount of detail for you in our communications? And that was about 92%. So people felt that we were doing that great. Then we talked about the different platforms for communication. So the top platform that we were using, what do you think that was? Any thoughts about what that might be?
Email.
It's where you are right now. This is a form of communication, right? You're at a conference, you're communicating, you're networking, you're hearing information, and you're communicating. So that was the top one. E-news was up there high, webinars. The social media kind of stuff was still, down in the pretty low. The Twitter, the Facebook, et cetera, that was still fairly low in the organization. So now, after we've talked with our members about, are we communicating frequently enough with the right amount of detail? Do you like the platforms we're using? And then the next thing is, so what are we talking about? So as we went through that survey, what we found was that there were, we first asked our members, we gave them a long list. I don't know if those of you did this. Let me ask that question. How many of you in this room did the survey? So maybe roughly half, maybe a little better. So we felt our survey responses were pretty strong. We had about 260 responses. Our survey consultant said that's pretty good. So But when we ask, we give them a long range of issues about what things might you be very interested in hearing communications about, regardless of what platform that is. It could be events, it could be webinars, it could be news, it could be our e-news or just straight email, webinars, et cetera. YouTube videos we had on that as well. And so we ended up with this, we have a very diverse membership, as most of you are aware, that have a very wide range of interests. I've got 3 staff members, so at some point I've got to set priorities on what we're communicating about, because their plates are pretty full already. So the challenge then becomes, how do we prioritize that long range of topics? We asked the members to first off identify those things that they were very interested in. Then we asked them, from all that long list of things you're very interested in, what are your top 3 priorities? From there, if you, as you then walked through each one of those things that you thought was in your top 3, we asked folks, what do they want to hear about from us? And so we'll be summarizing that as we go along. Our next steps are to do the theater sessions right here, where I've got board members here in the room, and we're videotaping. And so one of the things we're looking at doing is just trying to get the temperature in the room about how excited and interested people are in these topics. From there, the Water Congress Board, our next meeting is at the end of September. We'll start looking at what we heard and starting the process of prioritizing those. And we have a communications framework that we rolled out also started a draft in January. We'll keep working on that, but that framework is more about how we're going to develop the communications plan rather than the communications plan itself. So it's an approach. It's a little bit like the water plan. It really wasn't a plan, it was more like a framework in some ways, right? So those are our next steps. We'll probably be working on this last one for a while. So again, we're in 3 different rooms. We'll have 2 to 3 speakers per topic in each room. We'll spend 20 minutes or 25 with each topic. And you'll hear 4 different issues in this room. So we'll do 2 issues, take a 15 or 20 minute break, and then we'll do 2 more. Which means that you're not going to hear about the other issues that other people are talking about. So hopefully when you ride the gondola up, you can have a chance to dialogue. What'd you talk about? What'd you talk about? So we just chose this approach. We could have, to march everybody through to even 12 issues. I don't think we'd have people with much patience for that. And that list of issues from the survey easily could have been 24 or more. So yeah, it's a challenge. So what we're going to do today, we're going to present some information about an issue, discuss is there a communications problem with this issue, and also is the Water Congress uniquely the right entity to communicate about that. So we're hoping to get as much of your feedback and interaction as we go through that. So that'll be the next step, will be to get you as engaged in that as possible. And then stay tuned, because there'll be more opportunities for member feedback as this communications plan rolls out. It is a work in progress for a while. So our first issue that we have is conservation, and we'll have Becky Mitchell jump up here in just a minute. Most of you, this conference is kind of our opportunity to introduce Becky Mitchell to you, and so she has a chance to get to know her a little bit better. When we did the member survey, people, from the responses, it was somewhat interesting that, which surprised me a little bit, that there seemed to be a slight, and I don't know if it was statistically significant yet or not, but seemed to be a slightly more interest in ag issues and municipal conservations. I thought that was interesting. And then overall, at least in terms of water efficiency, we'll talk about that in a second, there seemed to be a little bit less interest on that topic. So those were the 2 of the things that jumped out at us from the survey. And so now, Becky, if you come up and join me. And so one of the things that that's difficult about communications, I think, is on conservation is, what the heck does it mean?
Yeah, it gets pretty difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because everybody has a different perspective. I think it's important to recognize, as I listen to what, sorry, Am I in
No, you're
anybody's
not.
way?
You're good.
As I listened to what Doug was saying about, I think the exact words were, tell me how you're working to advance my mission. And
Yeah.
so I think all of our mission was, in the water plan, we stated 400,000 acre feet of municipal conservation. And so I was really excited to get this topic. So I don't think we are speaking the same language, because we say that, but I don't think everybody has the same ideas on how to get there. So we are the Water Conservation Board, not the Water Preservation Board or the Water Efficiency Board. So I think we have a pretty good idea.
Have you thought about changing your name to one of those, or?
Absolutely not.
Okay, so you're comfortable with the water. So when the Water Conservation Board was created, how long? 75 years?
More than 75 years
Yeah,
ago. I think it was 79 at this point.
John, you were there then.
And anybody who has the answer to Doug's questions can shout them out. We allow shouting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or I'll run a mic to you. Yeah. So when you're talking about conservation with people, does everybody? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Or when we talk about these different terms about preserving water versus conserving water, those get to be two different things, don't they?
Yeah, we really see that conservation is not about holding the water, but how we're using it in the most efficient way possible for all the uses.
Sure.
So throw something at me if you disagree, or yell something
So
out.
yeah, we're encouraging disagreement here. So Paul, do you disagree with what you just said? Oh, good.
Well, darn it, Paul.
And I will remember all of our fellows in the room here that we do have to speak on the mic, because they are recording this so that the folks who aren't in this room get to hear everything we have to say, and we get to share those issues later. Well, just to point out that you said it is conservation. When he asked you to explain a little bit more, efficiency was in your answer.
Yep.
So I don't know that we're going to solve that issue here today, but I think it has to do with what do we want to hear from Colorado Water Congress about conservation? And I think what Doug is saying is that at the Water Congress right now, if you polled all of our membership, you wouldn't get that cohesive answer that you feel you have ready for folks. And that pushes us from the communications piece into the partnership piece. And so what is the role of what kind of partnership do we have between Colorado Water Congress and the Colorado Water Conservation Board in explaining that, among other issues that we might have to talk about?
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we're here today is so that we can hear some of those different perspectives, because what I learned at lunch today, I actually learned more than I expected. And one of those things was that we had to hear all those different things, but actually listen to them and see if there was some way to look at the whole piece of it. So that was what my takeaway was. So if you have ideas that are different from mine, then I'd like to hear them. In terms of conservation, Dave Robbins.
I'm David Robbins. I don't have a necessarily different view right now. I just want to remind us we have to remember that the Water Conservation Board was set up 75 years ago, and conservation had a very different meaning at that time. Mm-hmm. And the historical goals of the board had significantly more to do with the construction of projects to increase, if not maximize, the amount of water that was beneficially used within the state that was available to us under our compacts.
And develop was part of that.
Yeah, well, of course, but I mean, developing the projects that were necessary to beneficially consume our compact apportioned waters.
Perfect.
So conservation had, at least then, a somewhat different meaning than it does today. That doesn't mean today's meaning is wrong. We're supposed to evolve.
Oh.
Ken.
Nope, I'll get her.
Oh, okay. My suggestion is that you have the meritorious objectives, but each stream has a bit of a different characteristic to it. And if you're dealing with the Arkansas or the Rio Grande, you're dealing with over-appropriated streams through which you cannot, for example, in the Arkansas, efficiency is not something you can do because you have specific court orders against efficiency. Now, if you're on the Cashaputter or the South Platte, 20% of that water is going to Nebraska anyhow. You can create all kinds of different efficiency, conservation, anything you want to do essentially on that river. And I suspect that if you get over into where we are right now, that the volume of the stream on an average annual day is enough that they don't have efficiency rules that would inhibit the use of that method in conserving water. So getting back to my original point, I think it would be helpful if you would treat each stream separately and not as a blanket.
Great. So that makes our problem even harder, doesn't it? Yeah, so now we got to talk about every river basin differently and given
A little bit of a eureka right there, right? I think was what we learned today. So how everybody's feeling like maybe their area needs to look at it differently or that stream needs to look at it differently. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over.
Thank you. When I heard that there was more concern about conserving for agriculture than from households, I find that interesting because we have seen ballot measures watering and they think they aren't conserving enough. And I think that's a little danger sign to say we're probably going to see more of these ballot issues coming up. And I think the public likes to think they're efficient at home more than the farmers are. So that concerns me because we are doing most of our water projects for ag. So I think that's another issue that we need to get the information to people.
That really did highlight one of the points that Doug and I spoke about prior to coming here was the ag versus municipal conservation. And so I think that again highlights why we're sitting here and
talking about the problem. So here are a few of the things that, and Becky and I, this in conversation kind of came up with about, some of these issues. So the first one is this idea of voluntary versus regulatory programs. And, there's, if you're talking about efficiency, are we going to talk about how we're regulating efficiency and water use and water conservation? That could be one approach, and yeah.
Well, and it's a good time to bring up Senate Bill 103. That I think is one of the ones we talked about, which is a municipal indoor fixture type conservation. We've seen some success with that. So I think it's important to recognize that we're still at the point where we have to quantify how much success we've seen and go from there. Go ahead, Mike.
Becky, my first interaction with people from your staff 10 years ago was, and I was Precious Paint in Colorado at the time, was to complete the conservation plan for the city of Fountain. And for anybody who has done a conservation plan according to the standards that you have to meet to reach that, it's a very narrow constraint. It defines conservation 9 different ways, and if you want to add one, you really have to advocate for why you want to add that and such. And so I think that might be constraining our discussion as well, because we've all had to do that, and then we're asked to look outside of the box, and that's the box that's already been constructed.
So what I'm hearing, Mike, is flexibility, and some of that would be an idea that we needed to look. Expansion and flexibility. I'm going to write that down.
There you go. So we hit on ag versus municipal efficiency, and certainly in the media pays a lot of attention to, I think, to the household use, and you get a lot of that coverage. The differences, and Becky, between large cities and smaller towns that don't really have much staff to be working on that. Is that, we could focus on those things too, communication-wise.
We definitely do. I think it's important to recognize there's different issues, different problems, different solutions, large city, small town. So some of the things that we've seen is that large cities may have larger problems, but more ability to deal with them in terms of resources, whether they're financial or human resource. The small towns may have large problems, but less people that are impacted by them. That doesn't mean they're not large problems. So how do we allocate resources appropriately? But as we're moving forward, think about the solutions that are there for large cities may not work for large towns or small towns. Does anybody have any ideas or conversation they want to have on that?
So I have a point. So I mean, you have cities like Uray that have pipes that are in their system. They're not metered. They have a system that was built 100+ years ago. A lot of leaking pipes, very loose, rocky terrain there, steep slopes. And one of the issues that they would have is, well, we can't afford to put in meters. We're a small town. And anything that we don't use, you know what, it's going right back to the river almost immediately. But if Arvada made that kind of statement, it just wouldn't fly.
Well, and we do have areas that are making those statements, but I think one of the things to think about as we're dealing with this is Inglewood probably did make that statement. They were not metered, and they said, okay, we don't have the money to do this. However, how can we do this? So they did a point of sale change where there was a fee every time there was a sale that went to a meter change. So it's how do we take down the silos so that some of the solutions that are happening in other areas, we can get that information out. So I think that's a big key, is saying, okay, how does Inglewood talk to Uray and say, here's what we did, this is what it took, the town council will have some trouble with this and this and this is how we dealt with it. So I think we're always looking for ideas on ways to pull people together so that there's some solution there. So I'm hoping you guys will think about that too.
Yeah. So as we're looking in other areas, upstream versus downstream impacts. So now you've got this thing of where you may have especially on the South Platte, Arkansas, those that one man's waste or return flows as another person's water right, and there's a tension there, isn't there, between upstream and downstream users, even between, like if I'm downstream, great, waste all that again, bring it over.
Yes, definitely.
Not quite
You're
that
right.
way, but yeah, right.
Does anybody I'm going to start calling on people because I want some input on this, and so does Doug, right,
Yeah,
Doug?
right, that's why we're here.
So this is really intended to be a dialogue, not a preaching. I think one of the things that brings up where we're trying to go within the state is the teaching versus telling, and that's really where we've tried to point the direction that oftentimes folks aren't responding very well to telling. So we're looking at that teaching component, but realizing that everyone in the room is part of the teacher, because I don't know, and Doug doesn't know the systems. And so we can't teach you about your own system or your own benefits or your what you've learned. So you have to help teach us.
Yeah. Yep. Why don't we hit the last one, then we'll I think that's yours on this passive versus active conservation. What's that?
Who wants to explain what passive versus active is? Because I will, but I don't want to.
Somebody in this room besides Paul. Okay.
Paul.
No, we can't. Here we go.
Let's see if he
The difference
can
between
talk.
passive and active conservation is?
Well, I don't know if this is the right answer or not, but I do property management, and so we get water from municipal and community sources. And the passive way to save water is to raise the bill so that the bill's higher, so you better watch it. The problem is with renters, if you don't pay the water bill, it runs with the property and you could end up with a huge water bill. So you pay the water bill and then you get a great big old water bill on your tenants, and so you try to tell them no kiddie pools, no playing in the sprinklers, blah, blah, blah. And it's just really hard to monitor, but that's what we try to do. But then if you think about it, the other thing that's happening is think of the tourists that come, and they're paying a lot of money for their hotel room, and so you can't monitor their showers, and they're going to do whatever they want with the water. So I think that's to where people aren't absolutely affected. I threaten to raise the rent if they don't watch their water bill, but that's a hard one, and I think that's where a lot of our water goes, to people that aren't responsible for the bill.
So you'll see, when I mentioned Senate Bill 103, right? So that would be an example of active conservation. We're actively looking at regulations to increase conservation. The renter may not feel it as much, because if you change a fixture, they may not even notice that there's a difference in that, or if there's a difference in flow, or that it's water smart. They may not notice that, but we're actively doing something to make a difference in how water is used. Paul, I know you have something to say because you're an expert on this.
Ouch. And a corollary to that in the passive sense would be when the old toilet wears out and needs to be replaced. The fixtures that are available now have to conform to the newer codes, and so there's going to be savings over time as fixtures get replaced with more efficient fixtures. Active would also be if there's a plan that a municipality has, saying giving rebates on inefficient fixtures, or actually you could say that higher water rates is an active measure, that a system can raise the water rates, have an increasing block rate there, and that's a very active thing that they're doing to get the attention of their customers and get them to reduce their usage. Whereas the kind of wet weather we've had this year has been a passive conservation measure, which has absolutely killed our revenue in Pueblos.
Thanks for the side comment, Paul.
One of the things, and Lois was looking at me when she was talking about those water bills, because I sent them to her. The only thing that works is hit them in the pocketbook. We had an incident 10 years ago with a bunch of our highest water users were using huge amounts of water. In fact, one of them was using 165,000 gallons a month in the summer. I thought Aurora had a great idea at the time, and they went to $10 over 30,000. So I adopted that. We adopted that at Ute Water. Aurora chickened out, City Council chickened out. But I can tell you in 2 years, those people cut their yearly consumption in half. And in the next 3 years, they cut it in half again. I didn't mind a $2,000 water bill if they paid it, but they didn't want to pay it anymore. And that's the only thing that'll get to people and make them conserve water.
Oh, yeah.
So before we leave that, so how did you deal with that with your communications with your customers?
We put a notice in the paper, put a notice on the bill, and said over 30,000 is going to $10. And we had some radical reactions. A guy came in and spent 45 minutes explaining how we'd raised his water bill. And one of my board members stood up and said, "You're exactly the guy we were after." And it works. It's the only thing that works.
Did they come in before or after? Like, did that notice?
No, he didn't come in until he got that water bill.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. They don't pay attention to the news or what you put on the bill.
Does not always work. So in our experience, it doesn't always work, though, to hit them in the pocketbook. But I live in a tourist area, and that's what we serve, where it's second homes, expensive trophy homes, things like that. We've got customers with $10,000 a month water bills that they just write the check. It doesn't really bother them. So social norming, or there's other techniques I think that we have to consider and work on to do that. Plus our tiered rate structure, what we're looking at is designed based on a volumetric rate, it doesn't consider application rate for irrigated area. And so what we're finding is there are homes on small lots that are using water inefficiently, but they're not hitting the higher tiers because it doesn't consider the size of the lot. Then there's homes on large lots that are using water efficiently that are in tier 5 and they're getting penalized. So that's a little bit of a challenge. We got to put resources to measuring and calculating what those rates should be for each individual customer. But I think if you want to promote efficiency and encourage it, you have to really look at it that way. So.
Question is what that do to our rates or our revenue? Actually, revenue stayed about the same. What they were paying under the old rate structure for a huge amount of water, they were paying under the new rate structure for a lot less.
I've seen some areas that are doing water budgets per individual lot, and that's getting some good airtime. You don't want to say? Oh. Okay, good.
Becky, let's move on. The question is, ultimately, as we're trying to figure out our own communications, is the Colorado Water Congress the right entity? Since we don't send your bill, we're not in charge of the water bills, and then if people aren't going to listen, then we're probably not going to be helpful. But is the Water Congress the right entity to communicate to the water community? Let's frame it that way. Is the Water Congress the right entity to communicate about conservation? There's the Colorado Waterwise Council, there's Colorado Water Conservation Board, there's plenty of environmental organizations that are willing to communicate about that. But is this something for the Water Congress, Mike?
Well, I think that with the diverse membership of the Water Congress, with water users as well as water providers, this is the correct place. When you talk to, and I've spoken at WaterWise, it's all the demand side of the meter. It's not the supply side of the meter. You touched on it earlier. You can put all the shower head restraints and all the small toilets and all the tiered rates in on the consumer side, but if you don't go back and systematically address your delivery system, you still aren't conserving. So I think that because we're here, that's not the people that Colorado Waterwise talks to. They're all focused on the end user.
So how might we, just quickly, any kind of thoughts about how we might approach that if we're to communicate with our members about conservation? We had a whole long list of things that we could be talking about conservation, but any thoughts that you or the room might have about which of those kinds of, because there's a whole lot of different facets. There's a point of this session, there's a whole lot of different facets you can look at water conservation through, and that drives how we communicate and what we communicate about.
I think it's also important to recognize the state versus local control at this
There's another
point.
one, yeah.
And recognize what role each organization plays in it. As I was sitting here today and I was hearing about some of the successes, Larry, you've had at Ute, and what's happened in Eagle, but how we're not turning on or off taps at the state level, but we really have a vested interest in hearing about what's worked in certain areas, so that where we, maybe there's a role to disperse the stories of success or stories of failure, if that's the case, so that other folks can learn from them.
You'll see that as a common theme across all of the issues that we've identified here is tell me about the success stories, tell me what's working, tell me where it's working. And to me, does that lead us to thinking more about partnerships with the Colorado Foundation for Water Education? Does that lead us to partnerships with the CWCB in terms of what we communicate? Does it mean more links across to websites, maybe respective splash pages on our web? Does that mean
We sure hope so.
doing more with the conference and stuff? Okay, good. We'll wrap this up, but let's take a couple comments here.
Just wanted to touch a little bit on that. Colorado Municipal League represents cities, special district associations represents districts. Both are water providers and both have those things in common. What special districts don't do is have any land use control. And that just came up in the last 2 years in the legislative session. So I think that this is the place to put that all together.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm probably going to start to sound like a broken record on this, but you put up your your strategic plan at the beginning there, and the top thing on there was policy and legislation stuff. And I think it makes sense to communicate about conservation issues as it relates to policy and legislation for you guys, and then transferring some of the rest of that stuff over to Foundation for Water Education, or using conservation stories as like a feature story in the summer when maybe it's slow, or at conferences where you can really highlight some partnerships and showcase some things, but not trying to like use all your staff resources to be constantly communicating about that issue.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's great. One of our ulterior motives for doing all this, we have several ulterior motives, but one of them is to also as part of a recruitment for our communications committee, our new standing committee, and to see if there are enough member interests around these issues to form a work group on what to kind of walk through that list that I had up there before. So the next steps on this as we go forward is is there enough interest in this particular topic that people might want to form a bit of a discussion group to kind of help shape what we communicate about conservation. So and think about that as we talk about our next couple of topics. So with that, thank you, Becky. I really appreciate that. Hand for Becky, please. She was doing our first experiment here. So now that we've got the easy one out of the way, this is what the clips look like for those, or about something like that, if those of you that might have missed it. This is our transition slide. So our next topic is compact compliance. So, Colorado has 9 interstate compacts. And we're going to have in just a second John McLeod and David Robbins talk to us about compact compliance. I don't think they're amongst our best experts in that area. So the member survey said when members wanted to hear about compact compliance, where do we stand on this kind of thing? So the first thing they wanted to know is what is our current status of compliance? How are we in compliance with all 9 of our compacts, and how are we doing with that? The second one, what is the state thinking? In terms of more, I think what they mean by that is, what's the strategy here with vis-a-vis other states and so forth. So they want to kind of climb into the Attorney General's head a little bit, and the CWCB's head, and the state engineer's head that work with these issues. What are the perspectives of other states? How are they looking at Colorado's compact compliance? And then lastly, how might all this affect water administration? The whole topic of compact call has become a bigger and bigger issue. So with that, we're going to bring John and David up to talk to you a little bit about what are the problems communicating about compact compliance, if we're to take that on. So John and David, you want to take us from here? And yeah, I think so. Let's find out. Oops. There we go. Okay.
So we want to start by saying that Colorado does have 9 interstate compacts, and David and I were talking about this a little bit in advance, trying to figure out which compact anybody wanted to know about. So I'm not sure how many of you in the room checked off compact compliance as a matter of concern, but here we have the 9, and they're listed in chronological order, not necessarily order of importance. So whoops. It's not.
Sorry, John.
That's all right. Well, we had an animation there, but you can see the map, I hope, where all of these areas of the compacts are reflected. So the issues that we're talking about addressing here are how does the Water Congress communicate about problems with compact compliance? So now we have to toss it out there to you. Which compact would you like to learn about? And neither David nor I can speak for the state, of course. And we have some understanding of what's going on in all of these 9, but we'll throw it out to you and say, what is it you'd like us to help you with in terms of compact compliance? This morning we had a panel that talked about the Colorado River Compact. And I think we do that at every conference, summer and winter. So my own opinion is we're covering it, Aaron.
While the mic's being given to Aaron, there's a fundamental tension between the last two comments, right, that Doug showed you. What's the state thinking? What are the other states thinking? And obviously what Colorado is thinking and has been thinking since the first compact in 1922 is how do we ensure that we are able to fully and completely beneficially use the water to which we're allocated. Number one. Number two, how do we make sure that we comply with the obligations which we have assumed by executing the compact? The other states are looking upstream saying, you dirty, egg-sucking toads, you are not sending us the water in the amount, in the quality, or at the time that we want it. And their attitude is reflected by the number of lawsuits that Colorado has been forced to defend over the years, over the last 80 years or more. Aaron.
So, that was louder than I expected. As you mentioned, the fundamental goal of all the compacts is essentially the same. Ensure that we can continue the use of the water to which we're entitled and ensure that we are delivering the water we're obligated to deliver. But the way that we've accomplished that in all the different basins through administration and through legal agreements is in many cases different. The way that we comply with the Republican compact versus the way that we comply with the Colorado, whether it's the efficiency rules on the Arkansas, all of these things are different mechanisms that we've used to either respond to litigation or to stay in compliance. And something that I've been really interested in for a while is looking statewide and seeing what can we learn. We're really good at creating these intricate systems to address regionally specific issues, but can we compare those? Can we think statewide about lessons learned from one region to the other? Especially looking towards what I think, at least from a scope perspective, is maybe the most complicated, the Colorado River. What can we learn as we get closer and closer to a potential issue there from the other places where we've done a really good job of being creative with the resources and the specific issues in the basin in the past?
Other places where we've been forced to do a very good job, right? We haven't done the Rio Grande or the Arkansas or the Republican River, any of those voluntarily. Those have all been based upon litigation by our downstream neighbors because there's been plenty of water in the Colorado up until recently. We haven't had any pressure to go through the pain that those other three basins at a minimum have confronted over the last 40 years.
Yeah, can we learn from that rather than waiting?
Absolutely.
I think that panel this morning was excellent. And they had those, here's some short-term solutions, here's some long-term solutions. That's the best panel I've seen on that in a long time.
So there, Doug, is some positive member feedback on how the Water Congress is responding to the interests of its members.
The answer to the first question is pretty short and simple, I think, and that is we are currently in compliance with each of our compacts. Some of our neighbors might argue on the fringe a little bit about whether we are truly in compliance, but we are currently not subject to any litigation, which is the ultimate marker of non-compliance. Other comments, questions, concerns?
Just from the communications aspect of it, I just looked it up, and the Foundation for Water Education has its Citizens Guide to Colorado's Interstate Compacts second edition available. So as to, those editions come out, there is certainly time in between when those editions are updated and upgraded. So it seems to me like we, as Water Congress, we can certainly refer a lot of questions to that type of a resource that already exists, but it seems as though it's going to be more a matter of as events develop in any of these compacts, that the updates and progress reports on those lawsuits and so forth might be appropriate for the Water Congress to keep its membership informed.
Thank you, Paul.
When you look at this map, you can see that some of these compacts have a wider impact than others. The Colorado River Compact, for example, affects a lot more people than the Castilla Creek Compact. So,
But you have to realize that, I pointed this out to John, for many of these compacts, the basins that are shown are geographic basins. They have nothing to do with the compacts. For example, the Rio Grande, this is the Pecos over here. It has a separate compact. The Rio Grande is really a narrow thread that, as far as Colorado's concerned, and our obligation ends right there at Fort Quitman, Texas. All of this is not subject to a compact. It's subject to the 1944 treaty with Mexico, just as an example. The South Platte, really, this shows the North Platte, which is a separate compact. Colorado cares about the North Platte because of a U.S. Supreme Court equitable apportionment decree. This part of the basin in Colorado is really only the South Platte, and we don't really care about the left-hand portion of the basin above Balzac because the compact really apportions the water between Balzac and Julesburg at the state line.
so as you see the list in terms of what the Water Congress can be doing for its membership, can you suggest to us any of these that we have not addressed on a routine or adequate basis in terms of our conferences and our other means of communication with the membership? As I said, we've done Colorado River a number of times, I know, and we've done the others occasionally. But what's your feedback on how we should be approaching all of these or any of them better? Any ideas, Andy? I'm asking you, Andy, do you have any ideas?
I think,
Mike.
I think as we go into some of the discussions on the lower basin, on the lower basin discussions as they kind of play out over the coming year with the change in administration and the treaty with Mexico, I think those might be some additional, every now and then it comes up, but with the unwritten or unadopted new minute that's coming forth, I think those are things that kind of lose perspective of, kind of on a broader context. So,
Larry?
Wait a second, let's get Mike here, then we'll get Larry, okay?
When I was on the Groundwater Commission, the state engineer at times would brief us on those compacts. And I would think at a Water Congress session, you could have a short briefing on each one of the compacts. I think that would be, I learned a heck of a lot about the Arkansas and the Rio Grande compacts and the Republican just from sitting on the Groundwater Commission. So I think if you just had briefings on them, I think it'd work.
Thank you. Mike?
When I hear the word status, I think my interest in the compacts is, I'd call it more risk. We're looking, what is the risk level that we're at in terms of being in compliance, or maybe it's a threat level like, green, yellow, red, whatever. But just, are we headed downhill, or is the status quo being maintained about the same, or are things getting better?
Thank you. Other comments? Thoughts?
I have a question, David. So, maybe for the audience, as you're looking at compacts, are you as interested in compacts even if you're not in the basin?
That's a good question, Doug, because compacts are really inside baseball. Anybody in the room here from the Rio Grande Basin knows pretty carefully and thoroughly how exactly that compact works and how it impacts their use of water in the basin. The same's on the South Platte, the Arkansas, the Republican. And so is it interesting to others to hear about these different compacts, or should we be focusing on one that impacts the state more broadly, like the Colorado?
Definitely all the compacts are important, and especially on those areas that are using Trans Mountain water, because if there's an issue with the Colorado, it's going to definitely affect the Front Range, and those, not necessarily the compact directly, but the amount of water in that basin.
Thank you. So there certainly is a tie, right, between compact administration and administration of water rights within the state and how people have access to water supply. It has to do with conservation too, Becky's topic, right? And there was an allusion to it, but remember these compacts were all negotiated in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And at that point in time, we had, the comment I made early on, conservation might have had a slightly different meaning in terms of the Water Conservation Board. And we were looking at the hydrology of these systems during a time when you might say we were using inefficient agricultural practices. It was pre-center pivot sprinklers, pre-drip, just about all of the current efficiencies. And so the inefficiency was built into the hydrology that was used to calculate how much water Colorado is entitled to use in each of those basins. So there's another topic where the two sessions today come directly together, because some types of current efficiency or water conservation have a tendency to make the obligation to administer water for the compact more difficult. Does anybody else have any thoughts? There's the Animas La Plata compact, the project compact, the shortest one on the books. We will share the Animas La Plata project in the following way if we ever get it built, which they did. Other thoughts? Yes, Andy. You'll have to talk into the microphone because this is being taped, and we've been told that that's a rule. Damn it.
Thank you, Sarah. And I guess just to build on, I guess, this conversation, I think it's, and somebody who checked kind of this topic is during the survey, I think it is a little bit about the risk. You know, some of the compacts probably pose greater risk than others, and you talk about the scale of risk to the state. You know, what are those risks? Those interplay between those various basins, you know, and how that story as we look at it. And so it's not just one basin against the other or anything else. It's how do we as a state kind of look at these things holistically, and so that people care about what happens in the Arkansas, even though you're not relying on the Arkansas. And so I think it's a good conversation, and we just to build on that connectivity.
Thank you. The one thing it seems to me we can all do, the whole state has to do, is to understand that these compacts don't change. Everybody who is a signatory to a compact got a piece of the pie. Nobody wants to give up a piece of the pie. So we have to learn to live with what we've got. We can't spend our time as a community debating whether or not we can afford to build a pipeline from the mouth of the Mississippi. We've got to spend our time instead figuring out how to live and making the tough decisions that we have to make in order to live within our compact proportion shares.
So there's the question on the screen, ladies and gentlemen, that Doug and the board and David and I are both board members. We would like to have our membership answer for us so that we can help set priorities for what the Water Congress will be doing in the near term and in the long term. So should this communication about whatever we define as compact compliance at this point, should that be a priority for this organization? Paul.
I hope it is, and I hope you all encourage Doug to have programs that talk about the reality of living with compacts and complying with compacts and making societal decisions based upon the water legally and physically available to our state, and not spend our time debating pipe dreams about how we're going to get water from someone else who actually is probably already using it, or thinks at least it belongs to them, and that includes the oyster fishermen at the mouth of the Mississippi.
I just think that, in answer to that question, not only the fact that this was checked on the survey, but just the level of concern in the room here today in the conversation, I think that should continue to be a priority for Water Congress. And of course, I'm wondering, Andy, if this is something that is in the federal affairs realm, the Federal Affairs Committee that we have in Water Congress, to be a resource for that. And also, I'd agree with what Andy said, is wherever there's information to clarify what the interactions might be. We've got a lot of sessions we've done, and there's a lot of even national press about Colorado River issues and how it affects the other basins. I personally will reveal my ignorance. I'm not sure if some of the other compacts may have an effect interbasin-wise that we just haven't had any of those conversations yet. So the expertise lies in a lot of our members, and so I'd look forward to continuing to hear about it.
And remember, when you see a map of the compact Colorado Basin, it includes the South Platte all the way to Julesburg. It includes the Arkansas, the Front Range of Colorado, all of central Arizona, the entire LA Basin. That's all part of the Colorado Basin, even though physically it's not within the basin.
I think we're out of time unless someone has a pressing comment or question.
Thank you all.
Whoops. Seeing none, we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. So we can do one of two things. We can take our plan is to take a break till 3:30. I've got a few minutes after 3 right now. We could get back here and start a little bit early if you wanted to, like at 3:20, and head to the gondola ahead of the other two rooms. But it's up to you. So this.
But just so we're clear, we all come back here.
Yes, everybody comes back in this
hour, and we talk about two
new issues. Yeah.
Topics.
Yeah.
I have a question for Dave. Mainly,
You have to say it into the microphone.
You're done.
I have a question. We're supposed to think out of the box for water, and when we think out of the box and say we should maybe look at the water in the Mississippi or the Missouri and pipeline in here, you have a different opinion of that because of the time and expense and the other people wanting that water. What other reason is it that we can't think out of the box and maybe store a lot of that water during the flood system in the Mississippi or the Missouri and put it out in the Eastern Plains and have water here for everyone in the far future?
My reason is because people want to talk about that so they don't have to talk about reality, so they don't have to talk about the real problem, which is we got to live with what we got. Because we're done with the federal government look at our federal government. We're not going to get any more huge billion-dollar projects out of the federal government. It can't happen. And so who's going to pay for this? Water's not compressible. You have to move enough to make a difference. Are we going to build, 10-foot in diameter pipes and pump water uphill so that we can grow $8 corn? No, I don't think so. We have to wrestle with the tough problems. I think if anybody could make an economic case for me that we could bring water from the Fraser River or the Missouri River or the Mississippi River and make an economic case for it, I'd probably be saying, let's keep talking about it. But I haven't ever had anybody make an economic case that we can do that, particularly not to keep our short season agriculture going. It doesn't make any, and the reason it comes up is every time somebody like me says, we've got to tighten our belts, we're actually growing too many crops because in some of our basins we're having trouble meeting our compacts. The Rio Grande is an example. And so what's the answer? Well, we'll build a pipeline from the Mississippi. I don't have to talk to you anymore, Robbins, because that's the answer. And so I want people to talk about real dollars and real problems, about if we're going to do it, how are we going to do it? Not as a diversion to talk about what we've really got to talk about in the next 20 years is how do we squeeze our state into the water we already got. I just, from my experience, is I don't see how it happens. I mean, I think it makes a heck of a lot more sense to me that to the extent we have years in which we have surplus flows, to be talking about building storage structures in Colorado and capture those. But the concept of pumping water huge distances uphill is just, I can't get my arms around it, I can't get my brain around it, because it just doesn't seem to me to make dollars and cents. Whatever. So that's my answer. That's why I say that, because I'm trying to push our community to have the real conversation that has to be had, and to not allow ourselves to be led off on, oh, we can do this, or oh, we can do that. La, la, la. Now we don't have to talk about the fact that we have some tough choices to make. Okay? And if there's anybody else who wants to pull my chain a little bit, you see, off I go. He knows that I'm sort of like one of those kids' toys. You pull on the chain and it dances around and waves its arms.
David, I think that was worth the price of admission right there. That's good. Okay, I've got now 3:07. Let's get back maybe 5 minutes early, and we'll see if we can't get started a little bit early. Okay, thanks again. We'll be back with 2 more issues.